The Impossible State. Islam, Politics, and Modernity's Moral Predicament. Wael. Hallaq. 5. The Political Subject and Moral Technologies of the Self. Technologies of the self permit individuals to effect by their own means, or with the help of others, a certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. For us now, this notion is rather obscure and faded. Foucault, Technologies of the Self. What did you learn in school today? Dear little boy of mine? I learned our government must be strong. It's always right and never wrong. Our leaders are the finest men, and we elect them again and again. I learned that war is not so bad. I learned of the great ones we have had. What did you learn at school today? Tom Paxton, what did you learn at school today? The state robs men of themselves. Johann Gottfried Herder. Every society, be it tribal, urban, or otherwise, knows and integrates into its structures one form of discipline or another. No society can live without an ordering apparatus that, by necessity, requires some type of discipline. But disciplinary forms are as numerous as the societies that lie by them. Their multiplicity notwithstanding, all but one share a common characteristic, namely, their organic constitution. All but one developed over many centuries or even millennia. Allowing social, spiritual, moral, economic, and political factors to blend in slowly and even imperceptibly. Creating in the process internal systems of checks and balances that were driven by an internally developing and socially based logic. Even when war devastated such communities, they in time regrouped and resumed their ways of living more or less as these existed before. Pre-modern societies, that is, pre-state social formations and outside of Europe, were largely autonomous and self-regulated in social terms and rarely and thinly penetrated in bureaucratic terms. Apart from the distant presence of the ruler and his unsystematic attempts to tax them, societies practiced self-rule. It is undeniable that these traditional societies differed from one another significantly. Yet for all their dissimilarities, they still differed considerably more from the discipline and order of the modern state social creation. Our concern in this chapter lies in these differences only insofar as they contribute to the formation of particular subjects. From this angle, we contend that the modern state systems of order and discipline are unique in human history, producing individuals whose subjectivities are unprecedented. If the state is a uniquely European product, as is almost universally agreed, and if the state is overarching in its control over its population, and here a few would disagree, then the subjectivities produced by the state systems must also be unique. It is precisely the quality or qualities of these subjectivities and whether they are compatible with those produced by Islamic governance that is our concern here. 1. The production of state subjects. Like the separation of powers, positivism, and the Enlightenment's distinction between is and ought, the form of discipline produced by the European state was unique. Geared as it was toward fashioning the subjectivity of the new citizen who recognizes himself in the state and is willing to die for it. If, in origin, the state was a uniquely European phenomenon, so was its offspring, the citizen. Distinctively and exclusively European. The genealogy of European state discipline was inextricably tied to the rise of powerful monarchs whose main concern had been to tighten their hold over their populations while enriching their coffers. They had sponsored and promoted colonizing ventures that brought home much gold and silver. Wealth that later supported an industrial revolution that capitalized on these gains, exponentially increasing profits and the accumulation of capital. Corollary with these developments, the urban populations grew by leaps, leaving wide segments of the population impoverished, all this while the upper classes watched their wealth grow with the support of, and in partnership with, the now emerging constitutional monarch. This was precisely the context that allowed Marx to insist that the state represents the rule of the bourgeoisie over the proletariat, the impoverished, rights-deprived laborers. Flagrant social and economic disparities. Working conditions beyond appalling. And monarchical rule barely emerged from the age of absolutism all gave rise to mob violence and unruly urban populations, which in turn induced the state to introduce an organized and well-staffed police apparatus that not only maintained a presence in these urban areas but extended its sway into the countryside, which had formerly been beneath the radar of rulers. By the later part of the 19th century, no village, town, or city could escape the watchful eye of this apparatus. And to reinforce the policing apparatus, an unprecedented, colossal prison system was created. But crude physical force was not enough, and this the European rulers understood. The population had to be educated in the ways of good conduct, and good conduct meant social order and, in a thoroughly capitalist system, an ability to work and produce. Discipline thus translated into a site in which the subject was corralled into a system of order and instrumental utility. The system that was adopted to accomplish this regulative mechanism was the school, which began to spring up everywhere in various forms, and concurrent with the consolidation of the police apparatus, the school became a standard social fixture by the end of the 19th century. Legislated as mandatory, literally coercing parents to send their children to schools on pain of imprisonment. Primary education forced the great majority of Europe's children into a regimented system where certain ideas and ideals were drilled into their minds. The days of learning within the family or church were gone forever. Still, policing and schooling were not enough. Poverty in the wake of the Industrial Revolution intensified, and social discontent became ever more evident. Vividly remembering the French Revolution and its causes of discontent, reformers, politicians, and rulers quickly realized that poverty could lead to another revolution, one that might snatch both political power and economic privilege from under their feet. Quickly enough, state welfare systems began to be established in all of the European countries, creating a social safety net and, even more importantly, public health institutions and specialized hospitals. On an epistemic level, the institutions of coercive surveillance, education, and health, prisons, schools, and hospitals, were neither distinct from one another nor neutral in any sense. They each worked in a specialized domain, but they worked together, having come into existence in the wake of a pervasive bureaucratic machinery that possessed distinct ideological claims. Schools, armies, hospitals, and prisons constituted systemic manifestations of an elaborate and highly specific way of doing and ordering things, which explains why the techniques used to implement them were rapidly circulated from one institution to the next and, in fact, from one European country to the next. Extensive regulations, shaped by empirical, calculated, not to mention calculating, methods, were applied to these institutions for the purpose of disciplining the operations of the body. They reflected the two major concerns of submission and utility. That is, submission to a regulating technique that engenders docility and, on the other hand, utility as a materially productive performance. From both perspectives, the body was not only a site of empirical analysis but also of intelligibility. It had become colonizable and as such capable of manipulation and analysis, of being shaped according to a particular will so that through it certain desired effects could be produced. This particular will was novel, for it issued not from the internal volition of the subject or the local community, a characteristic of the pre-modern world, but from an external force, a political will that located itself outside it. As Foucault noted, the human body was entering a machinery of power that explores it, breaks it down and rearranges it. A political anatomy, which was also a mechanics of power, was being born. It defined how one may have a hold over others' bodies, not only so that they may do what one wishes, but so that they may operate as one wishes, with the techniques, the speed, and the efficiency that one determines. The pervasive techniques of surveillance and the administrative regulations thus flowed from an external order with a view to dictating the very processes of the body's activities, not only the results of its performance. This was training, not just control. It was a process-based rather than simply consequentialist project. It falsely resembles ascetic training, because discipline, in both cases, is harnessed in the formation of a controlled body. But the differences, important for us, are both profound and significant, since the ascetic's achievement lies in maximizing mastery over the body as an internal exercise. That is, the operations he or she conducts are techniques applied by the self to the self. Techniques that seek the renunciation of the material world, holding in low regard utility as a materialist performance. This is perhaps the decisive difference between the qualities of the pre-modern and modern disciplinary types we noted in the opening paragraph to this chapter. A difference pregnant with significant implications. With the maturation of educational, bureaucratic, and discipline-based institutions, the initiation of the state subject was completed. Now, the state can use the trained subject as a fully developed skill or even as a tool whose performance is backed by self-imposed loyalty and efficient utilitarian enthusiasm. Put differently, it is no longer a monarch or an identifiable group that governs but the totality of social and bureaucratic, though always state-based, institutions. This is the background of the argument, often made with a view to explaining the success of Western democracies. That power shared is power increased, the argument itself being a part of the ideological justification of modern democratic forms. The argument fails on account of omitting from consideration the processes within the modern Western state through which the subject is tamed and rendered politically innocuous. For it is through these processes that massive institutions can be relied upon to do the bidding of the state. Institutions that also represent the state insofar as the latter embodies a collection of deliberately trained personnel. This bidding is no more obvious than in academia, a field that prides itself on intellectual independence and on conducting research and generating knowledge through the so-called scientific method. Knowledge that is regarded as resting on a dispassionate examination of the world. The fact remains that paradigmatic academia is a state institution in at least three senses. The first is its nearly unqualified and unquestioning adoption of the positivism of the state. Indeed, the scholarly paradigm of academia remains thoroughly, if not entirely, positivist. The second is the overwhelming acceptance of the state as a taken-for-granted phenomenon, this being presupposed in the discourses of the social sciences and the humanities. On the whole, academia thinks the state, nay, the world, through the state. The third is the role academia plays in state governance, and by this I do not mean only its direct involvement in the production of research with military and political implications. Itself a phenomenon worthy of separate consideration. Frequently drawing on the help of academia, the modern government portrays itself as a problem-solving machine, a characteristic always implied in government's self-declared goal of being in the service of the people. This, of course, is not a mere slogan. It reflects actual reality, especially in the modern Western state. However, the genealogy of this phenomenon is not always clear. The state is not an organic society in the same sense that traditional societies were constituted over a long stretch of time. In fact, the state is antithetical to such a society. The long history of human socio-political organization teaches us that organic societies did perfectly well without states. Which is precisely why the state never made an appearance until Europe invented it. Hence, the very notion of the state is synonymous with the disruption, dismantling, and rearrangement of the social order. The rearrangement and continuous re-engineering of society. Through economic policies. Unceasing. Even crushing. Reforms in education. Changes in the laws of personal status, healthcare, and social insurance, etc. No doubt solve perceived problems, but they often create many new ones, mostly unpredicted, of course. The perception that a problem exists and that it therefore needs a solution must also be seen in relation to the knowledge forms of the state. Which is to say that problems become ontologically possible only when the state becomes possible. It so happens that a great majority of these problems were the normal and even natural order of pre-modern societies, problems with which these societies had lived, without conceiving them as problems, from time immemorial. The attribute of problem-solving machine is thus one that is essential to the paradigmatic state. Governing in the modern state means addressing these and many other subsequently emerging problems ranging from crises in the family and depopulation and lack of economic competitiveness to urban poverty and the destruction of natural habitat. Task forces, investigative committees, research projects, proposals, and reports are all integral to the processes of the problem-solving machine. And the personnel directly involved in them are academicians, invariably scientists, social scientists, and philosophers of sorts. They all must accommodate this reality, which is to say, a reality that the state must face and thus, by definition, a reality positivist in nature. This is not to say that these academicians, especially the philosophers and their ilk, never engage with the moral ought, for they at times do. But what is sought after in government circles and what therefore receives emphasis in academic disciplines, through funding opportunities among several other forms of leverage, are those patterns of research and intellectual production that first recognize and then accommodate positivist realism. This accommodation must first obtain for any proposed solution to win a chance at being heard. To make itself relevant, as it must, academia, which educates the nation and its elite, exercises upon itself a particular discipline that seeks, among other things, to develop expertise in fields relevant to the interests of the state, although the porosity of state and society often clothes these interests in the garb of social and societal concerns. Governing, a business divided among countless departments and institutions, presupposes that the sphere under the purview of each of these units is capable of representation, that each sphere is known or at least knowable and therefore can be subjected to deliberative political calculation. Accordingly, theories of the social sciences, of economics, of sociology and of psychology, thus provide a kind of intellectual machinery for government, in the form of procedures for rendering the world thinkable, taming its intractable reality by subjecting it to the disciplined analyses of thought. If we think of education in the modern state, and in effect there is no formal education worth speaking of outside of its purview, as the site in which various strands of discipline intersect, bureaucracy, science, technology, political science, nationalism, etc., then it is a field that takes care of the subject during the most crucial, formative period of his or her life. It begins by instilling in the child skills and knowledge of utility and efficiency, of love for the homeland and its goodness, proceeding incrementally with the adult student to inculcate state interests, state priorities, state programs, nationalism, and state problem-solving ideology. This is not a unidimensional power imposing a set of alien rules on an externally situated object but rather a power that inscribes itself in the subject who has been endowed, through education and training, with the ability to be regulated, politically, willingly. To say that the paradigmatic state produces the paradigmatic citizen and vice versa is virtually to state a scientific axiom. To say that the modern state can live and be reproduced without its citizens is to say that the body can live without the circulation of blood. The point in all of this is that for the individual to be in and of the state, which the citizen almost wholly is, calls for a totalizing subjectivity, one reflecting, on a micro, socio-psychological level, several essential features of the state. It means the introduction of a subjectivity in the human subject, as the state is relatively new. It means the production of the unique homo modernus. The subjectification of academia, the elite pedagogical machine of the state, finds a parallel in a more essential social unit, the family. Here, the state is everywhere. It lays claim not so much on the family as an organic social unit, a sacred collective that nurtures happy and content individuals, but on the family as a production unit, namely, a unit that produces the citizen, the national subject. There is no nation-state that does not claim a monopoly over lawmaking, and there is no lawmaking that does not devote a good part of its attention and energy to legislating the family. The family, integral to the concerns of sovereign legal will, has been redefined to serve the state. A redefinition that was accomplished in the name of a program of priorities pertaining to the interests of the child. Interests that nearly always come prior to those of parents, especially the father. The child becomes the site in which the authority of the state unfolds as a program of reform inhabited by law, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and technicians. The patriarchy of the family is replaced by that of the state. It is the magistrate, the school, the psychiatrist, and the social worker that largely displace the parent. The concurrence of the juridical and the psychiatric professions marks the collaboration of two disciplines that are geared to produce the state subject, the national citizen. Adorno, as we shall see later, would add to this mix the culture industry that shapes the young and old into narcissistic, fragmented individuals. In his important work The Policing of Families, Donzelot characterizes the situation of the modern family as one of crisis, having changed from being a pillar of society to being the place where society constantly threatens to come unglued. This loosening of the family structure is the direct result of state policies, where the family appears fully integrated into the disciplinary apparatus installed by the state. The family thus appears as the troubled site of social subjection, of the impossibility of social autonomy. Just as the state has given rise to the realm of the political, it has also, through its discipline-based social engineering, created the realm of the social, where society unfolds in the image of the state. As Deleuze has argued, the crisis of the family and the rise of the social are the twofold political effect of the confluence of discipline apparatuses of the state. The social has thus become a hybrid domain where the political shapes society, particularly its children, according to a certain model. And the model is that of the national citizen, the citizen of the nation-state, with all the attributes that this identity comprises and implies. It is noteworthy here that the institutional, epistemic, and bureaucratic forms producing the docile subject of the state first preceded and then coincided in their operation with the rise of nationalism. In other words, nationalism not only presupposed these forms, which were instrumental in constructing the modern state, but also represented their correlative result. Patriotic speeches, ethno-national literature, public festivals, and much else of the sort pervaded history, recent and remote. But their new location and context within the boundaries of these new forms acquired new meanings, producing qualitatively effective means to enhance the subordination of the subject. The nation, therefore, is not some random group formation but rather a recently invented discursive and potent political practice that is fundamentally related to the modern state form. Although as an identity the concept of nation, alism, is never fixed. And although it is a continuous project and therefore represents an unceasing process of self-reproduction, it remains a constant paradigm that constructs, on behalf of the state, particular subjects who perceive themselves and who perceive the world in highly characteristic ways. More importantly, these are politically integrated subjects, which is to say that they are not integrated in a metaphysical or cosmic moral order but instead in the metaphysics of the state and its nation. Nationalism is perhaps the most significant source and groundwork of meaning available to its subjects. If we live in a world of states, and if out-of-state existence is impossible, then we all must live as national citizens. We are the nation, and the nation is us. This is as fundamental as it is an inescapable reality. Nationalism engulfs both the individual and the collective. It produces the I and we dialectically and separately. Not only does nationalism produce the community and its individual members, It is itself the community and its realized individual subjects, for without these there is no nationalism. Leading sociologists and philosophers have emphasized the pervasive presence of the community in individual consciousness, where the social bond is an essential part of the self. It is not only that the I is a member of the we but, more importantly, that the we is a necessary member of the I. It is an axiom of sociological theory, writes Skeeler, that all human knowledge precedes levels of self-consciousness of one's self-value. There is no I without we. The we is filled with contents prior to the I. Likewise, Mannheim emphasizes ideas and thought structures as functions of social relations that exist within the group. Excluding the possibility of any ideas arising independently of socially shared meanings. The social reality of nationalism not only generates meanings but is itself a context of meaning. Hence our insistence that nationalism constitutes and is constituted by the community as a social order. It is senseless to pose questions such as whether the mind is socially determined, as though the mind and society each possess a substance of their own. The profound implications of the individual's embeddedness in the national community is that the community's ethos is prior and therefore historically determinative of all socio-epistemic phenomena. And if thought structures are predetermined by intellectual history, by society's inheritance of historical forms of knowledge, then these structures are also a priori predetermined by the linguistic structures in which this history is enveloped, cast, and framed. Like law, nationalism is everywhere. It creates the community and shapes world history even before nationalism comes into it. There is no contradiction involved here, because nationalism is a metaphysic. It not only overrides history, it makes and rewrites it at will. The nature and power of nationalism could not be otherwise, because, as we said, nationalism and the state are not mere twins. They are embedded in each other, nationalism being one side of the coin that is the state. And no wonder that it is a metaphysic, for what else could it be if it is integral to the state and its own metaphysics? The state and its nationalism, conscripting the community both as politically sacrificable and socio-psychologically devout members, are two gods in one. This is the political framework and metaphysic within which the citizen is born. They shape him in their image so he can reproduce them, perpetually, for their own sake. The training of the subject extends beyond nationalism, although this latter is more or less present in all state training projects. Training in instrumentalism and efficiency, whose substrate is profoundly materialistic, has created what Weber called the iron cage, a set of cultural values and perceived opportunities that are constrained by material acquisitiveness and the particular outlook of rational choice. These two have, like nationalism and much else, come to constitute the state subject, creating a personality that cannot rest on or be shaped by spirituality. They are based on a technique of self-knowledge, what Foucault has called know yourself, not a technology of taking care of yourself. The distinction here is between rationality and practical ethics. The trained modern subject finds it difficult to base rigorous morality and austere principles on the precept that we should give more care to ourselves than to anything else in the world. We are more inclined to see taking care of ourselves as an immorality, as a means of escape from all possible rules. We also inherit a secular tradition that sees in external law the basis for morality. The efficiency and instrumentalism that have been pedagogically inculcated in the nurtured citizen would here come full circle. They would meet, within the confines and limits of regulated autonomous rationality, the law of the state, which represents as much a reflection of their will as they are a reflection of its will. And, to extend Weber's metaphor, it is within this iron cage of law, regulating bureaucracy, mechanization, materialism, and instrumentalism that the morality of the modern subject finds itself. The iron cage, a structure of interrelationships that is made of all these modern characteristics, sanctioned by the state, is also the site in which modern pedagogy conflates technical training with free intellectual inquiry. The systematic and systemic refinement of mechanisms and techniques geared toward regulative and instrumental mechanization has created a class of technical and intellectual experts whose talents are usefully put to the service of the bureaucratic and capitalistic machinery instead of nurturing truly free personal inquiry. For Weber, who saw capitalism as a compulsive apparatus rather than a locus of freedom, modernity, with its bureaucratic machine, heralded the decline of the cultivated man as a well-rounded personality in favor of the technical expert, who, from the human point of view, is crippled. Individual freedom and a rationally autonomous determination of destiny, relabeled by Marcuse as democratic unfreedom, amounted for Weber to a titanic tension between the moral/spiritual order and the world of matter and materialism, between the morality of taking care of the self and the morality of self-gratification. The premium of life value is now external rather than internal. It assigns supreme importance to discipline, efficiency, and work, three of the many lessons that the state came to inculcate, as second nature, in its citizens. Work for the sake of work, just as capitalism's money is made for the sake of garnering wealth, just as the state exists for its own sake and perpetuates itself for the sake of perpetuating itself. Weber saw in modernity's claim of progress a concept that amounts to the production and accumulation of wealth and the mastery of nature, as well as the idea of emancipating the rational subject. But the price of progress was what he called disenchantment. A deep sense of loss, the loss of the sacred, of a state of wholeness, of the spiritual anchoring of the self in the world, in nature, and in what I have called a moral cosmology. It is precisely this disenchantment that compelled Adorno and others to speak of the emotional impoverishment of the modern subject, of the standardization and automation of his psychology. The modern subject is isolated and fragmented, having fallen prey to a culture industry that has shaped for him and her a new type of identity. Sequestered from key types of experience, the self is energized against a backdrop of moral impoverishment and under conditions of substantial moral deprivation. The divisions of the inner self has resulted in a narcissistic individual whose frame of reference and meaning derives from the impersonal, from the ideal power types, represented in nationalism, fascism, Nazism, etc., that delude him into a sense of containment. In these power types the narcissistic ego finds refuge, stability, and even contentment. Modern capitalist society not only elevates narcissism to prominence, it elicits and reinforces narcissistic traits in everyone. But Adorno problematized this downward turn as a curative, in the sense that the nation and its meaning become the antidote to the fragmentation of the modern subject and to the Weberian sense of loss and disenchantment, taking over the past and the future and creating a universal historiography of its own. The nation becomes a natural ontology that retains not only values that displace and replace all values but also, as we have seen, a historical transcendence, a metaphysic. Nationalism thus developed as a necessary and integral component of the state phenomenon because it served as a curative against the malaise of state effects. The destruction and re-engineering of the social order, the subject's fragmentation, general instability, fragility, narcissism, etc. The metaphysical dimensions of nationalism and its psychological investment in the social order create for the subject not only a frame of reference but a world of meaning that replaces the world now lost. This is why there cannot be a state without a nation. And this is why the modern state must always be a nation-state. Because without nationalism the state would have as much chance to survive as a cancer patient has the chance of surviving without treatment. But as with any modern treatment, the cure has side effects. In the case of nationalism, these have been so grave that it is impossible not to conclude that the genocides and atrocities of the 20th century, and the present one, are the direct product of the phenomenon of the nation-state. As a dialectic of modernity, nationalism is the payoff for a disenchanted world, the mythic, naturaliste, non-rational fantasy produced by the demythologizing, rational development of the state. It comes to stand in for a guiding force of social and individual life. This in turn leads to identification with the nation and its figureheads as the grounding for subjectivity. Nationalism offers autonomy, self-determination, and particularity in the form of subjugation to a universal. It is an instituting moment for the self, society, and the state. Humanity no longer worships gods but rather itself as the transcendental nation. We become nationalist narcissists. 2. The moral technologies of the self. The paradigm of the modern state and its inherent capacity to produce subjects can find no common ground with the paradigm of Islamic governance. The two stand worlds apart. A central comparative dimension here is the controlling phenomenon of historical experience. The European experience that generated the modern state is just that. European. Islamic governance was squarely the product of Islamdom. Of the total historical experiences of Islamic culture, values, and Weltanschauungs, however varied within the tradition these experiences may have been. Constitutive of the difference is the absence from the Islamic paradigm of a monarch or state that controlled legislation. The legislative in Islam did account for the ruler and for a certain reality of politics, but it was not the product of politics or the political absolutism that Europe experienced. The merciless serfdom of feudalism, the abuses of the church, the inhumane realities of the Industrial Revolution, and all that which made revolutions necessary in Europe were not the lot of Muslims. On the whole, and despite the inescapable cruelties of human life and its miseries, which obviously are not the preserve of pre-moderns only, Muslims, comparatively speaking, lived for over a millennium in a far more egalitarian and merciful system and, most importantly for us, under a rule of law that modernity cannot fairly blemish with critical detraction. Nor did Islamic governance know anything like the scale of surveillance generated by the modern state's police and prison systems. These, so normalized and a matter of fact today, would have been horrifying to Muslims as specters of domination and cruelty. Nor, still, did Islamic rule so much as tamper with the sphere of education, which remained not only private but also non-formal and highly accessible, accommodating the entire spectrum of social strata. Sultans, emirs, and viziers did establish institutions for higher learning, madrasas. But like the judges they appointed and dismissed, they had no influence over what was taught and how. The subjects of education, mostly taught outside of royal madrasas, long remain those that were essential for the law and for satisfying the needs of society, that is, for leading to the desideratum of the good life. They invariably consisted of language, grammar, syntax, Quran studies, prophetic traditions, law, mathematics, medicine, chemistry, logic, hermeneutics, dialectic, rhetoric, and the like. These were intended for the development of skills utilized within the social order, including primary education, law courts, hospitals, market transactions, commercial dealings, etc. Certain skills, such as the scribal and the secretarial, were utilized at the royal court at the level of executive power. But these were skills largely devoid of political ideological content and remained squarely grounded in the established civil, mostly Sharia-controlled, network of education. In brief, like the Sharia itself, education was significantly independent of executive will, the latter having no control over either its substance or its religious moral constitution. Which is to say, still briefly though emphatically, that the capabilities of political power to produce subjectivities that would recognize themselves in that power did not exist. The slave soldiers we had earlier mentioned were almost always educated by the dynastic elite and the men of arms, so their education was relevant for the business of rule and war. They lived in relative seclusion from the population and its civil order. Yet, Islamic governance was productive of subjectivities that were paradigmatically Sharia-based. If the Sharia represented an expression of God's sovereignty on earth, then it was par excellence the context in which such subjectivities were fashioned. The Sharia subject was therefore drastically different from the subject produced by the modern state. Paraphrasing Foucault, one might say that the Sharia subject was the site of care for the self, while knowing the self, though not entirely unknown, was relegated to a distant second place. Let us now turn to this matter. Although, before proceeding, and in order to minimize our incapacities as modern observers of spatially and temporally distant cultures, we must briefly address a methodological issue that has a bearing on what it means to study the Islamic notion of care for the self. Central to modern moral philosophy is the question, why be moral? A question that presupposes a particular state of affairs in which consciousness of the moral as a distinctive, and integral category takes center stage, and where the moral is not to be taken as a matter of course. In the way the question, why be moral, is specifically posed, in the way it is predicated upon a particular set of assumptions that places restrictions on acceptable answers to it, and in the way it rests, together with these assumptions, on both genealogy and societal formation, the question is both unprecedented and unique. It echoes a fundamental quandary of modernity and the modern condition. It is a question that the mainstream Islamic tradition, in any of its pre-modern variants, never asked, at least not in the way modern discourse has posed it. Nor, as far as I know, did any other pre-modern culture. In its forcefulness, formulation, and conceptual origins, the question is modern, arising from and assuming the modern condition. It was the common understanding that the Sharia constitutes the path to the good life, a path that claimed to guarantee well-being in this world and in the hereafter, hence the implication, which remains no more than that morality cum law possess a teleology whose very fulfillment is their own raison d'etre. But in saying so, in separating the two realms and assigning to them two different concepts, our only way of expressing it, we have committed the first fallacy in examining the Sharia as outsiders. The imposition of a foreign vocabulary, by which discrete conceptual and organic units are identified and segregated, immediately becomes the first impediment to understanding, the first act by which the object of our epistemic inspection is contorted and defined in ways alien to its natural and native habitat. This is another way of saying that once the observer's language intrudes with its own repertoire of creating conceptual distinctions relevant and suitable only to itself, the subject is fundamentally altered upon the genesis of that epistemic inspection, that is, at the first discrete moment of its coming into existence. But in this act of inescapable linguistic play we do not merely alter meanings. We in fact reconstitute our objects. The distinction between and the segregation of the legal and the moral indeed constituted the first act in the emergence in 19th century colonial Europe of the academic subject of Islamic law. This law, another misnomer, was described and continues to this day to be viewed as having failed to distinguish between the moral and the legal. This perceived failure, a conceptual judgment whose standard was the paradigmatic model of European law, amounted to an indictment issued on grounds of both deficiency and inefficiency, an indictment resting securely on the ideological foundations constructed by the modern state. The scholars who created the knowledge that is Islamic law and whose measure of a legal culture is one imbued with the intrusive and ubiquitous agency of the state found incomprehensibly deficient. A law that not only seamlessly meshed with morality but depended on morality for enforcement. For, in their legal Weltanschauung, enforcement through morality counted for little, if at all. It is analytically tenable to predicate this mistrust on the history of the modern philosophical question, why be moral? But the problematic of such predication is not our concern here. The indictment also issued from a gross underrating of the moral force that was regarded within the Islamic tradition as an essential and integral part of the law. At the foundation of this underrating stood the observer's ideological judgment about religion. At least the Islamic religion. A judgment of repugnance, especially when religion as a moral and theological force is seen to be fused with law. The judgment, in other words, undercuts a proper apprehension of the role of morality as a legal form, of its power and force. Historical evidence was thus made to fit into what makes sense to us, not what made sense to a culture that defined itself systemically, teleologically, and existentially. In different terms, this entrenched repugnance for the religious, at least in this case to the Islamic in Muslim societies, amounted, in legal terms, to the foreclosure of the possibility of considering the force of the moral within the realm of the legal, and vice versa. Theistic teleology, eschatology, socially grounded moral gain, status, honor, shame, and much else of a similar type were reduced in importance, if not totally set aside, in favor of other explanations that fit better within our preferred, but distinctly modern, counter-moral systems of value. History was brought down to us, to the epistemological here and now. According to our own terms, when in theory no one denies that it was our historiographical set of terms that ought to have been subordinated to the imperatives of historical writing. It is therefore the unimpeded integration of the moral force within the Islamic legal world that commands our attention here. Whereas the answer to why be moral was, and rightly so, too obvious to Muslim legists to warrant much reflection on their part, our question must be, how was the moral subject fashioned? The immediacy of this question stems from a reality in which law fed on morality, in its multilayered social constitution. The Sharia, historically speaking, emerged out of a fundamentally spiritual and religious Near Eastern background and continued to evolve in ways that accommodated societies whose law was enmeshed with, and enshrined in, social and spiritual morality. In other words, the Sharia historically did not invent social morality but rather enlisted it in its own service and systematized it, feeding on its force and power in order to sustain its own moral concepts, practices, structures, and institutions. By capitalizing on the social substrate of morality, by giving direction and method to the force of social morality, the Sharia generated its own legal, but socially based, system of moral values. Hence the fundamental importance of the question. How did this system work, and how was the moral subject, the discrete unit of the community and communal life, fashioned? Obviously, Sharia's integration of the socio-moral force may be studied from a variety of perspectives. The legal historian and legal anthropologist, for instance, may approach the court and its functioning with a view to examining the dialectic between morality and law in the dual reproduction of the social order. These scholars may focus on the court as the arena of moral claims, where formal legal doctrine metamorphoses into applied practice, modified, shaped, and reshaped by the actors involved, including the disputants, their witnesses, the court's own witnesses and examiners, the audience present in the hearing. For example, the community's representatives, and the K himself, among others. The focus would be on the functioning of the court within the moral community and how the one influences and shapes the other. Another perspective. Our chief concern here is to examine the production of the moral subject from a schematic perspective. One that has the advantage of explaining the production of that subject before arriving at the court of law or before engaging with law in any of its worldly concerns. Put differently, the court, by virtue of the boundaries within which it operated, generally lacked the foundational underpinnings that fashioned the Sharia moral subject by means that were spatially and temporally prior to its involvement. For the moral subject was assumed to have already been fashioned qua moral subject within the law at the moment of the judicial event, at the moment, that is, when the law took for granted, as it always did, the presence of the moral force. If morality indistinguishably located itself within the habitat of law, it was because the subject of this law, in its individual and collective forms, was unqualifiedly assumed to be a moral agent. Otherwise, the Sharia's overall injunctions would have had no meaning within the contexts of social relations and would have been no more than a figment of the jurist's imagination. Our schematic account assumes a theoretical and practical interaction between legal doctrine and the individual Muslim subject as a member of the community. It is taken for granted that the Sharia as it manifested itself through legal doctrine in its substantive as well as procedural and due process provisions, had acquired in Muslim societies the highest form of legitimacy. That it was accepted as exemplary of what the law should be and is. That it was the fully legitimate contextual structure and paradigm in which the well-ordered society operated and lived. And that right and good practice was that which conformed to its prescriptions. This interaction, a socio-legal dialectic of the first order, finds ample attestation especially in the way I approach the question of fashioning the moral subject. My emphasis on the so-called ritualistic aspects of the law fortifies assumptions about the historical existence of this dialectic. For, to my knowledge, no one has made the claim that these aspects of the Sharia suffered any disconnection with practice and social reality. Even when skeptical Orientalism incorrectly argued for a divorce between Sharia's substantive law, on the one hand, and social and political practices, on the other, it never questioned the spiritual and religious, and, we may add, practical importance of ritual to Muslims. It is also posited that inasmuch as social and religious morality sustained the Sharia, the various parts of fiqh doctrine reinforced one another in moral ways. The morality that was fashioned in one area of the law constituted a moral prop for the enhancement and practical implementation of another area of the law. Yet since these areas were reflected and elaborated in juristic discourse, their arrangement was by no means haphazard or interchangeable but rather carefully structured to yield a particular effect. The arrangement and form thus impart much meaning to juristic expression as substance and content. This highly structured arrangement of legal doctrine best explains the programmatic efficacy of legal subject matter. An arrangement that has not thus far been subjected to our scholarly attention, much less analysis. The inattention to the significance of this highly deliberate doctrinal arrangement of subject matter must be tied to another distinction created by those modern disciplines that constructed the field of Islamic law. For more than a century, modern scholarship has viewed the Sharia's legal domain as comprising two main but distinguishable parts, one related to rituals and the other to so-called law proper. Islamic law proper, it was confidently and repeatedly argued, was that part of the Sharia which dealt with areas of the law that generally corresponded to what is regarded as law in the Western conception. These areas of law proper had been termed mu'amalat, indicating those spheres pertaining to legal relationships between and among individuals, such as family law, commercial law, and penal law. Ibadat, on the other hand, referred to those laws that were said to regulate man's relationship to God, clearly a religious set of practices. This sphere of ritual would therefore be largely set aside in scholarship until the beginning of the 21st century, when a very few writings dealing with ablution and purity finally appeared. But these developments must not be attributed to refinements in mainstream Orientalist knowledge, since these writings clearly represent spin-offs of developments in biblical studies and mainly anthropology. Still, none of these otherwise meritorious monographs appears to approach the rituals as an integral part of the law. Namely, to see these ritualistic performances as constituting a web of relations closely tied to the other strictly legal parts. None of them, in other words, has treated the ritual as constitutive of the strictly legal. It is my contention here that the segregation of the ritual from the legal was, and continues to be, a function of overlooking the moral force of the law, of failing to appreciate both the legal ramifications of ibadat and the moral ramifications of those strictly legal provisions of mu'amalat. As a rule, legal works of Islam, including those of the 12 Shiites and Zaydites, begin with 5 major chapters or books. Kutub, Sing, Kitab, each reflecting, in strict order, 4 of the 5 pillars of Islam, the arkan on which belief in the religion rests. As one important prophetic tradition announces, Islam was built upon 5 foundations, pillars. 1. The double testimony that there is no God but God and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Shahadatain. 2. Performance of the prayer. Alat. 3. Payment of alms tax. Zakat. 4. Performance of pilgrimage. Hajj. And 5. Fasting. The month of Ramadan. Apart from the first, a predominantly theological pronouncement of faith accompanied by neither substantive nor procedural rules, the rest, already enshrined as pre-Islamic religious practices, occupy a prominent place in the legal literature, having for the entire history of Islam been regarded as the foundations of religion and religious practice, blending the transcendental with the earthly legal, together with purification. Ahara. A prelude to and prerequisite for prayer. They have come to constitute the opening books of legal treatises, occupying as much as 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire body of these treatises. Created and constituted by the believers as devotional acts for the purpose of fulfilling a covenant with God. The religious works of the Abid appear to stand apart from the rest of the law. Where acts relate to worldly objects and persons and where the intention and raison d'etre is to acquire or sell property, marry, divorce, create partnerships, sue for damages, etc. The priority of these ritualistic chapters in the overall corpus of the legal works is reflected in their universal placement at the beginning, a long-standing tradition no jurist ever violated. But the placement was not merely an emblem of symbolic importance and priority. It had a function that made this ritualistic grouping a logical and functional antecedent. The function was subliminal, programmatic, and deeply psychological, laying the foundations for achieving willing obedience to the law that follows, that is, the law regulating, among much else, persons and property. The legal treatises, depending on the school and the jurist, began their second installment of exposition with either the contractual and pecuniary subjects, such as sales, agency, pledge, partnerships, rent, etc., or family law, marriage, various forms of divorce, custody, maintenance, inheritance, etc. Usually following these rules are sections dealing with offenses against life and limb, some regulated by the Quran. Hudud. Others by principles of retaliation or monetary compensation. Qiyah. The last sections of legal works usually treat adjudication and rules of evidence and procedure and often include an exposition of jihad. Although in some schools or juristic writings, this latter section appears earlier in the treatise. It bears repeating that whatever the arrangement of these chapters/sections/books, the materials dedicated to the elaboration of so-called rituals are always prior, having universal precedence over all else. Within this privileged arrangement, prayer still comes first. With its sequential bodily positions, it signals submission to a higher power. And with its recitals, invocations, and incantations, it expresses the need for that power's contentment and pleasure with the deeds and comportment of the believer. In the same vein, fasting compels identification with the suffering of others, generating compassion for, and even humility before, other human beings. It represents an acknowledgement of gratitude to God for the bounties He bestowed and continues to bestow on humankind, enabling them to enjoy earthly and material pleasures. So too does almsgiving engender empathy toward the needy and the poor, reminding the believers of nominal ownership of whatever earthly wealth they possess, wealth whose real owner can claim it back at his discretion. This cumulative enhancement of the recognition of God's generosity is crowned by the physically demanding act of pilgrimage, exhibiting the believer's humility and patience before God and His creation. As I have discussed elsewhere, the Sharia cannot be understood, nor could it have operated in any social context, without its moral bearings. The Sharia without a moral community, which assumes morally grounded individuals, was not Sharia. And morality, legal, social, or otherwise, traces its sources in large measure to the performative force of the 5 pillars. The morality that activated willing submission to the authority of the law was constituted by these performative acts. That they were given a prime weight and precedence was testimony to not only their ritualistic religious significance but also, if not primarily, their grounding moral force. To oust these pillars from the fiqh is to disengage the moral foundations of the law, to render the latter devoid of the most compelling impulse for jural observance. A muamalat law deprived of its ibadat foregrounding is thus a law that is not only lacking in moral force but a law that is inapplicable, ineffective, and frequently unenforceable. It is telling, therefore, that British India's governors, not least Cornwallis and Hastings, found the Sharia lax and too lenient in the sphere of criminal law and in much else. Before proceeding, something must be said of the double shahada, a pronouncement that receives no coverage in legal works. Inasmuch as the Sharia conceptually stood in an intimate relationship with the linguistic, logical, metaphysical, and theological, the double shahada harks back to a set of theological creeds whose locus is the ilm, theoretical knowledge, not the amal, practice and religious works. This theoretical foregrounding, defining double shahada's boundaries, explains its exclusion from fiqh works. However, the exclusion is strictly formal, having to do with the particular logic of arranging subject matter and of delineating the lines of separation between various yet interrelated fields of discourse. As a conceptual compound, the double shahada is an attestation to the existence of a higher order, one that is omnipotent and omniscient, who endures through eternity, who does not sleep, who knows the minutest particulars of worldly occurrences, and who keeps accounts, yet, he is all-merciful, compassionate, loving, and immeasurably forgiving. He is everything in their contradictions. Not a single attribute of his being is subject to analogy with other creatures. His compassion, love, punishment, and wrath are only homonymous attributes, the only way humans can understand him, relate to him, worship him, and love him. Whatever attribute of compassion or punitiveness we assign to him, it is like no other we know. The statement "there is no God but God" is a banner of surrender to this higher order, to everything and all that he is. If we seek nearness to him, we are seeking those attributes we want and avoiding those we do not want. It is not merely a fear of punishment that compels us to do the right thing but the desire for, and allure of, his love, compassion, generosity, peace, and eternal comfort. He is not a unidimensional entity of terror and fear, the inquisitor, the inspector of bad deeds, awaiting the slightest fault and misdemeanor to jump at the opportunity to punish. Rather, he is forgiving and, indeed before anything else, he is the compassionate and the merciful. Al-Rahman Al-Rahim. The two names by which he is famously and universally known, two attributes that announce him in all mundane and worldly Muslim speech. Divine punishment may be analogized to the coercion of the modern state, but this analogy is at best imperfect. For those who deserve punishment, God's is horrendous and eternally painful, to an extent and quality that cannot be imagined by the human mind. For the petty and not so petty wrongdoers, he is forgiving and merciful. Repentance pays. Not only can many bad deeds be forgiven, but good deeds are rewarded and have, in their overall weight, an offsetting effect against bad deeds. The reward is thus exponential. Doing good and performing beneficial deeds increases one's credit, meticulously noted in one's transcendental ledger. And everyone has a ledger. All this is to say that the totality of an individual's deeds are put to the balance and do not stand, one by one, as determinants of God's judgment. This calculus of incentive allows for much latitude in dealing with life's issues and earthly enticements, for engaging with the world and worldly affairs. What matters is the final accounting of the total sum of the individual's deeds, accounting being a particular calculus integral to and inherent in the revealed conception of God's justice. Thus, to do good is by definition to be near God. Qurba. In this life and in the hereafter, to be loved and in receipt of his grace and bounty. There is no God but God ultimately epitomizes but does not mask the totality of these relationships with the Creator, in their threat and promise. The second part of the Shahada, that Muhammad is God's messenger, modulates and cements the connection between the effectiveness of divine powers, the imagining of their actualized potential, and the practical reality of the believer. The message, the latent signified in Muhammad the signifier, constitutes the connection, the method of creating the epistemic link between the known and the unknown. It is this message that announces the Sharia, and it is with the full acknowledgement of this announcement that the subject subscribes to the rules of the order that is the Sharia. Thus containing latent assumptions of theory and knowledge, the double Shahada is, from the fiqh perspective, an end in and of itself. There is no more to do about it than to require its physical pronouncement, provided it is done with full intention. The rest is hidden in the cerebral and emotive world of the believer. Purification. Ahara, wrote one jurist, is the key to prayer, the latter being the most certain of Islam's pillars after the double Shahada. Although it is not itself one of the pillars. Arkan of religion. Purification as a juristic subject occupies a relatively prominent position, amply attested by the fact that its treatment in legal works occupies space roughly equal to each of the 5 pillars. Save the double Shahada. Namely, prayer, alms tax, fasting, and pilgrimage. Juristic works differ greatly on the detailed prescriptions on how to wash and on which surfaces of the body to wash. But whatever jurist's doctrine is adopted, purification must be applied according to that doctrine's prescriptions. Yet purification is not limited to the believer's body but rather extends to her clothing, the place in which she intends to pray, and the very body of water used for washing. Again, ample space is allotted to the discussions of what constitutes ritual purity and impurity, where the latter resides inherently and where and how it can be removed. The overall effect is a multitude of details, each requiring not only close attention by the believer but careful performance, insofar as they enclose the full range of required acts of purification. They constitute a complete system of orthopraxis that at once prepares the believer for the realization of the act of prayer and drills her inner self and body in programmatic ways. The exercise, repeated for the entirety of adult life and in view of its ultimate purpose, is saturated with both spirituality and psychology. Be that as it may, the foremost condition for the validity of ablution, as in all forms of worship, is the all-important attribute of intention. Niyya. The worshipper must have the intention to purify herself when embarking upon washing the face, the first step in the performance. Niyya occurs in the heart. Qalb, the vehicle of rational thinking and abode of reason. It may or may not be accompanied by a verbal pronouncement, although some jurists require it. Operating at a deep psychological level. Niyya is an internal state whose presence gives each act of worship its identity, separating it from other identical acts that do not belong to the category of worship. For example, washing the face or giving away money. The latter might be an act of paying alms tax, zakat, which also requires niyya, or merely a payment for a purchased object, while the former might be an act of ahara, ritual purification, or a mundane act of refreshing oneself. Niyya constitutes an awareness of, and confidence in, the individual act as fulfilling a particular purpose that is squarely categorized as an act of worship. Acts that cannot be mistaken for any other actions do not require niyya. The presence of niyya in the repeated performance of a ritual act is therefore insurance that the act is not constituted through a physically mechanical performance devoid of content but is rather engraved onto the mind and soul, in the rational and emotive faculties, at every individual performance, as if the act is being performed, every time, for the first time. The importance and effect of imbuing every ritual performance with originality of intent was well appreciated by the jurists. Indeed, it was a self-evident matter that acts of qurba are entirely based on niyyas, which is another way of saying that an act without niyya can never be constituted as one of worship. Niyya is the heart, soul, and backbone of religious works whose validity and invalidity are predicated upon it. However, to intend an act of worship presupposes an emotive predilection on the part of the individual. It would be meaningless to attempt the fulfillment of a religious obligation if the performer dislikes the performance. If, that is, the niyya is caught in an emotive web of reluctance or resentment. Inasmuch as God is to be loved, performance of acts directed toward him are to be loved as well, for Naya presupposes love. A well-known hadith announces that the best of people is he who intensely adores. Ashika. Worship, he who embraces and loves it. Abba. With all his heart. He who brings his body in contact with it. He who devotes himself to it. He who has no care in the world as to whether he will wake up the next day poor or rich. A constitutive element of prayer and a condition for its validity. Naya is required to affirm one's consciousness of the obligatory nature of this act and to declare which of the 5 daily prayers one intends to perform. Another constitutive element is the opening invocation. Takbirat al-Ihram. Consisting of the declaration God is great, intended to remind the performer of the gravity of this act of worship, of the exalted and magnificent status of he to whom one is praying. It is recommended that the worshipper pronounce the opening supplication. Dua al-Istiftah. Which announces one's monotheistic faith and loyalty to the one and only God. This pronouncement may be followed by another, seeking refuge in God against Satan. Tawhid. This latter signifying all temptations to do what is less than moral. At this point, and upon every act of bowing down, the Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran, is recited in full and concluded with the Taymin, the solemn ratification Amen. Upon the first and/or second act of bowing down, the believer is encouraged to recite a Quranic chapter, however short it may be. Bowing down, in its minimal form, requires as much bending as one needs to place her palms on her knees, this being followed by a pause, then praise to the Lord. Tasbih. When standing up, the body's posture must be perfectly straight, so that this position is not confused with bowing. If a straight posture is to be ensured, it is with a view to making unmistakably clear the identity of the act of prostration. Sujud. To isolate it as a univocal bodily language of obedience, subordination, and humility. The more upright the body is, the clearer the processes of bending and prostration will be, and the more demonstrable and unqualified the humility is. Prostration requires the exposed part of the forehead to touch the ground, pausing in this position at least for a moment. Again, to ensure the identity of the act as one of submission. To qualify as a prostration, the head must be lower than one's lower back, a posture intended to reinforce humility. As a metaphor, this position precludes the possibility of meeting between the worshipper's eyes and those to whom he is prostrating. Any physical impediment preventing a full prostration, for example, pregnancy or a back injury, waives the requirement inasmuch as one is unable to perform it. Intended to establish a certain connection and closeness. Qurba. Between the worshipper and her God, prayer, as I already intimated, is the most important of all religious acts after the Shahadatain. Hence, any adult deliberately desisting from praying was to be charged with apostasy. Prayer was so fundamental that it had the distinction of being the only ritual performance claiming to be the constant companion of the believer. Claiming a minimum of 5 performative acts a day for the entire duration of adult life, prayer exceeds in importance any of the other 4 obligations. The Shahadatain, pilgrimage. Required once in a lifetime. Fasting. Ramadan plus some optional periods. And alms tax. Once a year. Each and every Muslim who is an adult and compos mentis must pray, adulthood technically beginning at puberty but practically and for purposes of early training at 10 years of age. It is significant that the obligation to pray in effect begins at this young age. Nowhere outside of the pillars is an obligation imposed on individuals who have not reached majority. This latter normatively defined as occurring at puberty, although this physiological state must also be accompanied by full mental competence. Reaching puberty without this competence will not allow for this passage to occur. In every other sphere of the law, majority that gives rise to the full range of obligations and rights is one that must be commensurate with mental maturity. Rushd. A state of intellect that demonstrates the individual's ability to act prudently and responsibly. Ayla. In the pursuit of life's needs and requirements. A person who has reached the age of puberty but who continues to lack the quality of discernment necessary to manage his or her affairs will be subjected to legal interdiction. Ajr. In which case a guardian is appointed to act on his or her behalf. This normative juristic position is, quite untypically, entirely abandoned in the case of prayer. Thus, at the age of 10, a person may be disciplined for failing to perform this act, the rationale being that by the time they reach majority, that is, puberty, he or she is expected to be a consummate practitioner of prayer. For while other engagements in the law require no prior training and can therefore be accomplished at once upon maturity, prayer constitutes a complex process of outer and inner performances that need to be learned over time. To produce the moral subject of the law is to induce in the individual, in every individual, the programmatic effects engendered by prayer. If puberty/majority ushers in legal obligation at large, then the moral subject must have already been fashioned prior to the genesis of these obligations. Limited to the bodily and spiritual spheres, prayer's inducement of morality does not extend to all vital aspects of the believer's material, social, and psychological universe. Hence the necessity of setting in motion other pillars, foremost among which is the zakat, alms tax, which, by Quranic ranking, immediately follows on the heels of prayer in importance. Among all branches of the law, zakat is unique in that it has a dualistic character. On the one hand, it is an integral part of religious ritual, and, on the other hand, it functions as a substantive legal sphere, constituting itself as a tax law. Inasmuch as socially based financial responsibility merges into reduality, reduality merges into the moral accountability for society's welfare. Like the ubiquitous charitable trust, Waqf, zakat was one of the most important instruments of social justice. Literally meaning growth, zakat bears the extended connotation of paying out of the growth on one's property with a view to purifying that property. In one sense, zakat is the financial/material parallel of ritual ablution. Just as washing removes ritual filth, zakat removes the moral burden that accompanies the garnering of wealth. In other words, and to state a major Islamic tenet, to be wealthy is potentially a moral liability that requires dispensation, and the means of such dispensation is the sharing of that wealth with those who are in need. The sharing of excess in wealth with the Quranically specified beneficiaries, the poor, needy, and wayfarers, is seen not only as such a means of purification but reflects, among other things, the belief that all things ultimately belong to God and that Muslims are the trustees of earthly wealth accountable, furthermore, for the ways in which they dispose of it. Hoarding wealth is a cause for divine condemnation as well as for the eternal punishment of the hereafter. The payment of zakat is obligatory upon every Muslim, male and female, including, according to Malikites, Shafi'ites, Anbalites, and 12 Shiites, minor and insane individuals. As in prayer, the imposition of zakat on minors has an acculturating effect, engendering a moral impulse at a young age and preparing the individual, once reaching the age of majority, for accountability toward his or her social environment. The obligation imposed on the insane stems from financial aspect of the zakat, the counterpart of that aspect which is ritualistic cum moral. To be valid, zakat, like all ritual performances, must be accompanied by niyyah. The indispensability of niyyah draws a thick line of separation between, on the one hand, the voluntary and willing performance for the sake of God and, on the other, the coerciveness that is involved in what might be termed here secular taxation. However, niyyah precludes a sense, on the part of the subject, of imposed obligation. Arguably, a duty may be distinguished from an imposed obligation, in that there is a wide margin of difference between asking for the best one can give away and what one must give away irrespective of willingness or ability. By contrast with the rate, not to mention nearly immoral manner, of taxation in all industrialized countries, zakat is levied generally at the rate of 2.5% of growth on one's wealth, after all amounts needed for subsistence have been deducted. This exemption, known as nisab, represents a size or value of wealth below which no zakat can be levied. A property whose value falls between two nisabs, namely, one that has not reached the next nisab, is exempt from levy on the differential. For example, if the nisab of a certain commodity is 5, a person who owns 9 units of that commodity would be paying zakat on only the first 5. In one important sense, zakat represents at once an extension and an enhancement of prayer. For while prayer applies to the soul and body, zakat transcends the immediate confines of physiological constitution, creating moral accountability for the sphere that lies beyond the self. It is not only the body that is subdued but also that material sphere which falls under its command. Taxing wealth is therefore not only a practical proof of social accountability and responsibility, which translates into doing the right thing toward the needy and poor, but an indirect way to ensure thorough corporeal subordination. While zakat is designed to tame the body through excising that material wealth through which bodily pleasure is procured, fasting, Psalm, engages the very body of the believer on another level of excision. It is a tax on the flesh and body of believer, on the very nourishment on which it lives. This sense of bodily taxation is evident in the fact that although fasting is usually associated with the month of Ramadan, it plays other important roles, most notably as penance or expiation. Fasting during Ramadan is obligatory, by universal agreement. Exempted from the duty to fast are the sick, pregnant women, nursing women, the elderly, travelers on long-distance and arduous trips, and persons whose health may be threatened if subjected to this performance. All others must fast. To be valid, abstinence must aggregately and concurrently include all food, drink, sex, and sexual play and must begin at dawn and end at sunset. The subject must be a Muslim individual of majority age, without the impediments of insanity or uncleanliness, both of which invalidate fasting. Majority, for purposes of fasting, begins at around 10 years of age, the early start. As noted above, being viewed as necessary to inculcate the practice in children who will have to fulfill this demanding obligation in the most complete fashion when they reach puberty. The implication here, as in prayer, is that, until puberty, some lapses may be tolerated. Menstruation and postnatal bleeding, among other impurities, invalidate the fast. So is the absence of prior intent, niyya, which is indispensable for validity. During Ramadan, or any voluntary period of fasting, the intention regarding the next day must be declared each preceding day between iftar, breaking the fast, and the light of dawn. When fasting resumes, intent must be present until the end of the fasting day. Failure to maintain intent, even for the shortest duration, is cause for the fast's invalidity. That niyya plays here a psychological role as important as it does in prayer need not elicit further comment. Fasting is not confined to the month of Ramadan. During certain other times of the year, fasting is recommended on a voluntary basis. Tawu. This being both a performative and conceptual parallel to the zakat al-fitr. Whereas optional fasting represents an added sacrificial act involving the body, zakat al-fitr further complements the sacrifice in terms of external ownership of the body. Thus a spiritual and material link is created between the tax/fasting individual and the community in which she lives. It is precisely where the individual deprives herself of bodily pleasures that she contributes to the bodily pleasures of others. The food she does not eat is what others who need it will. Fasting, like zakat, is thus intimately connected to those areas of law that regulate various aspects of social and economic life. Just as zakat engenders notions of charity that sustain philanthropic enterprises, such as the all-important waqf. Fasting, insofar as it constitutes control over sexual desires, engenders conceptions of social discipline. Inasmuch as the highly commendable institution of marriage was intended, at least in part, to restrict zina, Sexual fasting provided the psychological substrate of training the soul and body to avoid this abhorrent and criminal practice. Fasting, therefore, represents the tip of the iceberg. A trenchant social ritual, it powerfully and psychologically underlies and in fact constitutes the economic, social, and moral spheres. Underlying fasting lie various rationales, all of which aim to train the self to acquire and augment compassion, self-discipline, and gratitude toward both the Creator and creation. Experiencing hunger and thirst through fasting restrains the soul and trains the body to control physical and mental desires. It teaches compassion for the poor in whose life hunger is prevalent. Zakat, therefore, comes to complement fasting, for it is only through the latter that the rationale of zakat unfolds and is made comprehensible. Furthermore, the actual experience of thirst and hunger serves as a strong reminder of God's blessings on us, of the bountiful existence He created for us. It is an instrument to thank the Lord Giver. Munam. In this way, fasting becomes another rationale for zakat, this time not vis-a-vis the poor but rather vis-a-vis the natural world surrounding us and the very nature that makes us what we are. Abstinence from sex and its pleasures teaches not only self-control but also an appreciation of that nature. Should fasting be unintentionally interrupted by invalidating acts, including mistakes and forgetting, the believer must make up for those days in their entirety, even if the invalidity had entered fasting shortly before breaking fast. Intentional acts of eating, drinking, and having sex invalidate the fast and require penance. Kafara. In addition to kafara may be fulfilled by freeing a Muslim slave in good bodily health, failing which, fasting for 2 consecutive months, failing which, feeding 60 of the poor. Women who engage in sexual acts during fasting must make up the fasting but are absolved of the duty to do penance. Finally, the last of ritualistic performances that enhance the subduing of both the body and soul is pilgrimage. Classified as a pillar, it is incumbent upon each and every believer at least once in a lifetime, the strong implication being that anyone who abjures it may be deemed an apostate. And as is the case in all the other pillars, the penalty for failure to fulfill it is less because one is abandoning the community of believers and more because pilgrimage is necessary in order to ensure a complete subordination to the set of 5 performative rituals. This is why there was, to my knowledge, no discussion among the legists about situations where a believer would perform all pillars but one. In other words, abjuring one pillar was not a political marker of religious identity or a marker of an ideological rejection of religion. Rather, the conscious rejection of a single pillar was primarily seen, though at the level of underlying fundamental assumptions, as failure to complete the set of religious works and performances that complete the program of fashioning the religious individual, the moral subject. To miss the performances entailed in a single pillar is to tamper with the total sum of effects that the set of 5 pillaric performances are intended to accomplish as an aggregate. It is in this sense that abjuring one of the pillars constitutes apostasy. Apostasy, it must be said, is not just an act of rejecting the Muslim God, for, on its own, it is merely a summative declaration that implies and encompasses certain collective and foundational derivatives. It is indeed the moral implication of this declaration that was at the heart of the matter. Fundamentally, therefore, apostasy is the rejection of the moral instruments that fashion the moral subject. If it is one side of the coin, jihad is the other. Apostasy law intends to curb the moral damage of the community's inner sphere, and jihad intends to protect and, if possible, expand the limits of that sphere. The obligation to perform pilgrimage is subject to exceptions, nonetheless. It is not incumbent upon those who are unable to perform it, that is, those who are not in possession of istia'a. Furthermore, the believer subject to it must be sane, of major age, and free. Istia'a consists of the following elements. A. The ability to provide sustenance for oneself as well as for the dependent family members whom the pilgrim leaves behind. B. The means to afford travel costs, food, lodging, etc. c. Being healthy enough to travel and endure the hardships involved in the journey. And d. The concomitant feasibility of A, B, and C during the season of pilgrimage. Some jurists added the condition of travel safety and security on pilgrimage routes. The legal duration of pilgrimage extends over the months of Shawwal, Dhu al-Qa'dah, and the first 10 days of Dhu al-Hijjah. Generally, it is recommended that the obligation be dispensed upon one's fulfillment of all conditions relating to istiya'ah. The first of the 4 essential components of pilgrimage is entering a state of ritual consecration. Ihram. This state begins with the niyyah to perform pilgrimage in a specific form, namely, to perform Hajj alone, minor pilgrimage alone, or both together. A ritual bath, ghusl, is then taken, also accompanied by the niyyah that the act is performed specifically for the purpose of entering ihram. Shaving pubic hair, plucking the underarms, clipping the mustache, and trimming nails are then in order. Clothes that have any sewing on them are changed for a white garment, and sandals that must not cover the toes or the heel are put on. The body should be perfumed, for men and women, and for the women it is recommended that they dye their hands with henna. Finally, a prayer consisting of 2 rak'ahs is performed, the first requiring the reading of Quran 109 and the second Quran 112. Once all this is done and the believer begins journeying toward Mecca, he or she is said to have entered the state of ihram. During the entirety of the ihram period, it is forbidden to wear sewn garments, to remove hair or clip nails, to engage in sexual activity, or to hunt. The law of pilgrimage, like the law pertaining to the other pillars, is complex and replete with exquisite detail. Yet the rationale behind this juristic complexity, behind the discursive and actual practices involved, is comprehensible to laymen and jurists alike. Through the performance of Hajj, a relationship of acceptance is reenacted, acceptance of and submission to the greater power of God. The submission to and humbling presence before God are enhanced by the shedding of earthly luxuries. By wearing the most basic of clothing and footwear. By abandoning all worldly concerns. And by focusing the heart, qalb, the mind and soul on the graceful, generous, merciful, compassionate, and creative God. It is the last and final performative pillar that crowns the acts of worship and seals them into a cogent, enclosed, and complete body of works that ensures the act of submitting to the will and power of the lawgiver. In their aggregate force, these performative acts provide the modalities through which the moral foundation and moral dimension of the law are constituted. A powerful commentary on what Foucault called the technologies of the self was offered by Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. D. 505/1111. One of the towering intellectual figures of Islam. Indeed, in most ways relevant to our present discussion, Foucault was a thoroughgoing Ghazalian, though a much less engaged one in his assessment of the pre-modern subject. In any attempt to understand these technologies, Ghazali's value is inestimable, perhaps because his life, at least as a biographical exemplar, and scholarly spiritual pursuits reflected the synthetic practices of mainstream Islam in its Shari-Yufist, and philosophical manifestations. His consummate exposition of the Shari and the mystical and moderated acceptance of philosophical metaphysics reflected much of what religious culture propounded, practiced, and held dear. His magisterial and influential Ihya Ulum al-Din, in particular, offered an ethic that mirrored the Shari-Yufist orthopraxis, one that defined much of what Islam, as a lived spiritual and worldly experience, was. His Ihya is a virtuoso exposé of the art of religious practice and, indeed, of living and the good life. It is paradigmatic. If one can say that the modern age is one overshadowed by Kantianism, then the several centuries of Middle Islam were overshadowed by Ghazalianism. A practical guide, Ghazali's work rests on what we now call a theory of human nature. The essence of his theory is that human beings, al-insan, are pliable in their natural constitution. They are neither good nor bad in their original state. Humans are made of different potentialities, which, once given substance, determine what each individual will become. In each of us, there are 4 potentialities: the aggressive, beastly, satanic, and divine. Sabiyya, Bahimiyya, Shayaniyya, and Rabbaniyya, respectively. Anger, animosity, violence, and courage are the preserves of the first. Greed, gluttony, caution, and lustfulness, of the second. Deception, lying, and trickery, of the third. And knowledge, ilm, intellect, cognition, gnosis, and understanding, of the fourth. This fourth potentiality also includes a strong innate predilection to command, dominate, and moderate the other 3. This is not to say, however, that the fourth potentiality stands in diametrical opposition to the first 3, having monopoly over positive attributes and detached from their negative counterparts. The first 3 potentialities, however, do include attributes that possess the capability of being good or bad, since courage, for instance, is harmful if not restrained, and so is caution if it becomes excessive. Each human being enjoys a certain measure of these 4 potentialities, and only the prophets were free of the first 3. However, the potentiality of ilm is both the quintessence and raison d'etre of human beings. It is the exclusive venue through which the individual can attain perfection, for the potentiality whose sphere is control and dominance reigns supreme. This human potentiality of Rabbaniyya was bestowed with the power to exercise complete and absolute mastery over the others, a power to subjugate and vanquish them. It is the master instrument of taking care of the self. These potentialities are located in 2 distinct spheres, the first 3 occupying the sphere of soul, nafs, whereas the fourth resides in the sphere of heart, qalb. Yet knowledge and therefore intellect, aql, do not only inhabit the heart but also constitute it. Indeed, the intellect is the heart. This latter is defined as a divine grace, Layfa the true nature and essence of the humankind, Hakikat al-Insan, as well as the source of all human knowledge. This is an all-encompassing intellective and cognitive faculty that, when exercised, brings under its purview also knowledge of value, because the world, suffused with value, can appear to our intellection and cognition in no other way. On the other hand, the soul is the domain in which the other potentialities gather. The stronger the actualization of these potentialities, the more evil the soul becomes. Thus, under the influence of the commanding heart/intellect, the soul might rebuff and suppress the actualization of the non-divine potentialities. In acting that way, the soul might be elevated into a stage in which it garners consciousness of the divine potentialities, positioning itself in a state of self-blame. Lam. This soul, al-nafs al-lawwama, thus represents a middle stage, one of transformation leading to a higher stage, namely, the peaceful soul, al-nafs al-muma'ina, that has succeeded in ridding itself of all negative qualities. The relation of the commanding intellect over the human body and its soul finds an analog in the metaphor of a king's rule over his kingdom. Just as he must be the manager, mudabbir, of his domains, exercising control over his army and protecting his subjects, so must the intellect restrain desires and whims of the temporal body. The seditious elements in the kingdom, as much as the evil soul in the body, must be defeated for the kingdom, the community, and the constitutive individual to maintain their integrity and peace. Should the king fail to protect his subjects, he will be censured and condemned, just as the body and the intellect that resides in its heart will be consigned to hell. The political duty of the ruler is thus cast as an analog of the care of the self. Both rest on a bedrock of obligations, not rights. The operative assumption here is that these obligations ought to be fulfilled, and when they are not, failure turns into liability. Reflecting a pervasive ethic, Ghazali's discourse places much emphasis on the relationship between man and his physical environment, especially earthly wealth and material abundance. It is up to the intellect to determine the extent of indulgence in such abundance and wealth. True, Ghazali argues, God created the earth and all that is on it for the enjoyment of humankind, but all this bounty must be put to meaningful use. A notion heavily emphasized in Islamic discourse. The human body is a vessel and a means by which one must reach a destination. Human beings therefore are no more than travelers, and temporal life is no more than the distance of travel. Each day is yet another traversed mile toward the end of the journey, and earthly desires represent nothing less than highway robbers. The greatest of all desires is ravenousness, the source of all spiritual maladies, followed, in second order, by lasciviousness. Ardently seeking to fulfill these desires inevitably involves one in garnering wealth, in turn leading to indulgence in both spheres. It appears that Ghazali posits a causal link between these two instincts, on the one hand, and the personal desire to acquire power and influence, on the other. To protect wealth and power, it is inevitable for the covetous individual to engage in competition and envy, which in turn engender greed, hypocrisy, arrogance, and hatred. And once these become habits of the soul, it is a short step for the individual to be implicated in morally repugnant acts. Nor is this causal link affected by notions of heredity or genetic transmission. Obviously, the kind of discourses propounded by Galton, Spencer, and Gardner were far from being on his mind, leaving him with a notion of human nature that is determined by the intellective faculty of will. Irata. The latter, emanating from the heart, stands in opposition to the negative potentialities, since its burden is both the determination of evil consequences and forewarning against them. The will is the abode of both conscientiousness and accountability, and it is found in each and every one of us. Nothing is therefore predetermined. It is up to the heart and its faculties to succeed or fail in completing the journey of life without falling prey to the highway robbers. Individual responsibility is indeed great. Ethical conduct is thus entirely acquired and a matter of training, for had it not been so, there would have been no meaning whatsoever to moral exhortation, counsel, and educational instruction. For Ghazali, as for the tradition that produced him, education was an essential tool of caring for the self. In fact, acquisition of ethical conduct begins with attentive listening of the heart and its will to the narrative of counsel, abundantly available in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. This narrative instructs: there is no act more dear to God than that of hunger and thirst, and no one who has filled his stomach to the full will enter heaven. Hunger, in this narrative, is said to engender a pure heart, compassion, humility, modesty, remembrance of the plight of the hungry, and, most important of all, curbing desires and misdeeds. Once heeded, this narrative has the effect of instilling a kind of conduct that produces benefits. Hunger drives away sleep, for he who overeats oversleeps, and sleep is much like death. It shortens active life and deprives the believer of the opportunity to strive. Jihad. For self-improvement. Overeating likewise produces sluggishness, another cause not only for neglecting the care of the self but also of bodily ailments. Care of the self is accomplished through training. Riyadha. A thoroughgoing process of subjecting the self to repeated exercises that shape and form the soul. The process might begin with a cumbersome effort, which tends to evolve gradually into a sort of normal conduct, ultimately becoming a second nature. Every act of such formation emanates from the heart but spreads its effects into the limbs, extremities, and the outer physical body. The body would be ordered to move or not move and to act according to the heart's intellective orders and directions. Once the body is attuned to the imperatives of the intellective power and becomes automatically responsive to the latter's ways, the body redeploys the same effects back to the heart and intellect. In other words, the body's trained behavior, instilled as a second nature, in turn enhances the heart's predilections. At this point, the intellectual and bodily performances begin to run in harmony, involving a circular, dialectic motion. Door. This reciprocity in turn produces mutual corroboration as well as progressive and exponential effects. Now, in Ghazali's conception, the spectrum of training extends over the entire range of human acts. Living, in and of itself, is training. Yet the source of training resides in a set of well-defined acts that have been constituted as paradigmatic. Namely, the 5 pillars we have discussed earlier. They represent the means of attaining akhlaq, that is, the corridor through which foundational ethics can be acquired. Ghazali's discussion of the 5 pillars, geared toward teasing out their ethical effects, is passionate, imaginative, metaphoric, and aphoristic, enriched with a quasi-legal and quasi-mystical language. This synthetic articulation appears faithful to the reality on the ground. A reality in which mainstream mystical Yufism and Sharia were entwined, amalgamated, and merged into a unified field of discursive and technological practice. In the final analysis, then, the training is defined and implemented by the pillars. If the range of life and living must be the object of training, then every aspect of life must be ultimately subsumable and indeed implied by one or more of the 5 pillars. Prayer is constituted by the works performed by the heart. Min amal al-qalb. Which ipso facto means that the heart must be concomitantly present when it is performed. This presence is represented by niyya, amplified and enhanced with a layer of meaning over and above the basic meaning we have already discussed. The presence of the heart, your al-qalb, is of the essence, defining the precondition of prayer. This presence dictates full attention to the addressee, for, after all, prayer is a conversation. Munajat. Of the heart between the believer and his God. One cannot have a true conversation with another while distracted by other matters. The niyya is precisely the guarantee for conversational concentricity around and exclusivity of the subject addressed. The required purity of this conversation translates into a deeper meaning of niyya, one that, Ghazali says, is not present in any of the other pillars. The very act of detaching wealth from the believer necessarily gives meaning to a level of intent in the zakat even when conscious intent fails to be present. Since this extramental act of detachment forces itself on the heart and thus bestows on it a notion of intent, however incomplete. So too do pilgrimage and fasting, for the hardships involved in these performances force the inducement of a certain level of intent. But not so in prayer, because it merely requires speech, kneeling, prostration, and standing up. Acts that do not demand extraordinary effort. Without niyya in prayer, the act itself does not count, however frequent the performance may be. Associated with pure intention and exclusive attention is a profound understanding of the import of language used in prayer. Every word has a meaning that must be comprehended, so every word matters. For it is the meaning conveyed in language that permits the performer to genuinely address God as the Great Being. Amat Allah. An essential attribute that establishes a particular relation of power between an inferior and a superior. Also integral to this relationship is a deep sense of awe and reverence. Haiba. Accompanied by an equal awareness of one's own shortcomings. Aya. The latter represents an intellective consciousness of the constant desire for and pursuit of the care of the self, that is, a consciousness of a founding ethic that underlies all other performances. Embedded in prayer. The first pillar of all. The desire of training the self and of improving it lays the logical and chronological foundation for the proper pursuit of other obligations. The seeds of ethical conduct thus lie herein. A faculty of the soul, desire is a state of will. Irada. Through which niyya is deployed. Niyya therefore is an internal act that cannot be expressed through external means. For instance, one cannot be said to be in love by merely declaring, I intend to fall in love. To be meaningful, love must be emitted from the inner self. Yet genuine love is not just an example of inner acts. Indeed, it is the desideratum and substrate of niyya, for love gives niyya its fullest manifestation. True love emanates from an inner perception. Al-bara al-batina. A faculty of the intellective heart. This perception is superior to sense perception in that it is intensely more acute and is thus quicker in registering comprehension and, moreover, at a deeper level. The capability to register abstract meanings operates internally and can thus perceive inner form superior to any external image. It is only through this means of perception that one can truly love, for no external sense perception can be of help. Love of God for Ghazali appears to outweigh fear of divine punishment, for this love dominates his discourse throughout the Iya. The care of the self is therefore entwined with this love and follows as a consequence. To love God is to care for the self, to train it, and to subject it to a self-reflective and consciously intended routine of performative acts. Love is pervasive. It permeates prayer and fasting as much as pilgrimage and giving alms tax. The latter, for instance, has several functions, foremost among which is its power to test love. It is a test that distinguishes and then forces a choice, for love is a homonym that appears to obscure rather than reveal meaning. But its final truth must finally come to light. Ghazali rejects eliding and confusing different forms of love, insisting on the necessity to identify inferior forms of love and making them entirely subservient to a superior form. Ultimately, it is inevitable that one type of love must be sacrificed to another. Pronouncing the double shahada is a commitment to unity, a testament to the individuation of him who is worshipped. A condition for the fulfillment of this pronouncement is that there be no beloved other than the individual one, for love is incapable of partition. However, verbal pronouncement alone is of little use, and so the lover is tested by taking away from him that which he loves. Material wealth is loved by human beings, for it is a tool with which they enjoy worldly pleasures and because of which they both find comfort in this world and fear death, although it is through the latter that one meets the beloved. People are tested for the veracity of their pronouncement about the beloved by means of exacting their wealth to which they aspire and which they love. In this paradigmatic conception of mystical Sharism, morality becomes entwined with virtue. As H. A. Pritchard once averred, we must sharply distinguish morality and virtue as independent, though related, species of goodness, because the virtuous act is done willingly or with pleasure. What Ghazali would characterize as an act of love. It is not done from a sense of obligation but from some desire which is intrinsically good, as arising from some intrinsically good emotion. Thus in an act of generosity the motive is the desire to help another arising from sympathy with that other. An act which is not at the same time an act of public spirit or family affection or the like. The goodness of such an act is different from the goodness of an act to which we apply the term moral in the strict and narrow sense, viz. An act done from a sense of obligation. The overall effect of the conception of mystical Sharism, exemplified here in the Ghazalian discourses, is precisely to bring the virtuous to correspond to and permeate the moral. 3. Incompatibility of subjectivities. It was, then, the coming together of the triad of law, morality, and mild mysticism, in their nearly imperceptible interconnectedness, that allowed Ghazali and a host of others like him to speak of such technologies of the self. Love and fear combine to instill a profound sense of subservience to a higher power that created, and therefore owns, everything in this universe. In Ghazali's account, as in the Yafist tradition that thoroughly permeated conceptions of the moral law, love acquires a prominent status in the relation between man and God. Caring for the self and training the self are means to express this love, for the very expression represents a guarantee of qurba, the gaining of a place near God and becoming his neighbor. Jawar. On this conception, there was no question as to the reason why one should be moral, only how one fashions oneself as a moral being. And the venues of this fashioning were consolidated into a set of mutually enhancing acts performed on the self. The truth of moral conduct and the right things to be done before God and one's fellow human beings were manifested in actions that were moderately ascetic, exercising effective influence on the body of the believer so that the soul can be shaped to obey the intellective moral imperatives of the heart. Here, man's view of his place in the universe is one of an epistemic relation between asceticism and truth, a truth that has no end, not even with death. that the notion of care for the self is now obscure and faded. As Foucault tells us, is testament to an epistemic transformation wherein the technologies of the self have turned into technologies of the body. Technologies that at best can accomplish the feat of knowing yourself. As it has been frequently observed, the emphasis on the I and on what things mean to me is intimately connected to the constant search of the narcissist to relate outside events to the self's own needs and desires, it being the focal point of existence. Thus, the transformation amounts to changing the site of fashioning the individual from the inner self to the outer body. Hence the much talked about trend toward modern phenomena of hedonism and self-indulgence. The new technologies of the body heed the imperatives of the material world, of shaping the corporeal, strengthening it and prolonging its temporal residence on earth. The result, as we have seen, is disenchantment, fragmentation of the self, and a thoroughgoing narcissism. If, in the technologies of the self, fasting shapes and trains the soul, in the technologies of the body it strengthens the body itself, the shell without its spirit. Yet, fasting in the two technologies is done with other qualitative differences. Whereas one engenders in the self a peaceful soul, al-nafs al-muma'ina, the other procures a physically healthy body. Whereas in the technologies of the self the relation is between asceticism and truth. In the technologies of the body, the relation is between corporeality and truth, the truth of value-free science that sees no inherent meaning and value in a mechanical, brute, stupid, and inert world. Concomitant with this transformation is another that occurred in the relations of power. Whereas the technologies of the self tend to induce self-restraining notions in these relations and therefore a certain unity with nature and being, the technologies of the body tend to engender the view that the corporeal field of power relations is the ultimate measure of man. This is the man who has come to inhabit a modern world that recognizes very little other than the political. Other than the conquest of a world that is normatively mute and devoid of moral directives. This is the man who sees the world as it is, a positivist being admitting of power and might as the sole logic and law of socio-political relations. It is noteworthy here that this transformation explains not only the emergence but also the strong relevance of Foucault's own power/knowledge theory in recent times, a theory that, I suspect, would be both dubious and irrelevant to a culture whose main prop is the technologies of the self. In one important sense, Foucault's success as a power theorist is predicated on his very diagnosis that the notion of caring for the self is for us moderns rather obscure and faded. The Ghazalian project thus represents not only an intellectual synthesis of morality, law, theology, mysticism, and philosophy but also an anthropological foray into Muslim subjectivity, capturing the intellectual, social, communal, and psychological forces that shape this subjectivity into a paradigm. The juristic discussions of the five constitutive pillars, the indubitable foundations of the concept of what it means to be a Muslim, are not only taken for granted but also turned into socio-psychological tools of cognitive and behavioral construction. Juristic charism, in other words, becomes a sphere of culture inasmuch as, if not more than, the modern state has acquired a chameleonic social and cultural character. In Ghazali and in the entire pre-modern Islamic tradition, law is embedded in a dialectic not only with social and cultural norms but also, preeminently, with psychology as a mildly mystical realm. We can thus comfortably assert that the Sharia, in addition to its trenchant legal moral character, represents at once a field of practical mysticism, and as such it is thoroughly embedded in the mainstream euphistic ways of Islam. If we accept this much, then the implications are both profound and serious. If the Sharia was also a psychological mystical enterprise, and if it constituted the paradigmatic and undisputed legislative power of Islamic governance, then this governance was not only about law, morality, and their organic confluence. It was also and equally about a mystical perception of the world, a perception deeply anchored in a society, represented by a class of mystics cum jurists, that did not distinguish, in the practice of living, between the meanings of the legal, the moral, and the mystical. The question that should arise here is, how would our world be if the legislative power in the modern state could indisputably and exclusively determine the law of the land, a law that, within the bounds of the civil population, would be thoroughly honored by the judiciary and the executive? And how, given this genuine separation, would our world be if this law was at once both moral and mildly mystical? Western moral philosophy, as we saw, has developed certain critical strands of thought whose effect is a call to draw on the moral repertoire of the European intellectual heritage. That is, but this remains only a rather thin attempt that has not come anywhere close to becoming an emerging paradigmatic force, much less a paradigm. The state and its successfully produced modern subject. And also, as we will soon see, capitalism and the corporation have all been steadily and increasingly working toward ensuring that no such paradigm can come into existence, including, and especially, an Islamic one. The state's homo modernus is, by definition, antithetical to the homo moralis of our gaze.